Today on Tiny Voices, we're looking at anonymity, disinhibition, and alternatives to removing that anonymity to curb toxic behavior online. That and more today on Tiny Voices. Since antiquity, we've contemplated what a person might do with complete anonymity. In Plato's Republic, he brings up the myth of the Ring of Gyges, an artifact said to have the power to grant its owner the ability to become invisible. Plato uses the myth to examine if a person who possessed such power, free from observation and accountability, would behave morally. Oh, if only he could be around today to see the rise of the World Wide Web. Starting on October 1st, China will be instituting a new nationwide policy requiring that online handles used for social media and message board posting be linked with the user's real identity. While in this case, it's a naked ploy to silence anti-regime dissent in the form of quote-unquote illegal messages which would harm the social order, it did sort of remind me of the time that Blizzard pondered implementing a similar real name policy on their forums in order to hopefully curb flaming, harassment, and other toxic behavior. The backlash to that move was both swift and deafening, so the idea was scrapped altogether, but ever since, it's had me thinking about the pros and cons of such a drastic maneuver. Could it even work, and why does anonymity seem to draw out our baser natures in the first place? With this fresh in my mind again, and hot off of talking about the history of MOBAs last week, a genre infamous for heightened levels of communal toxicity, I wanted to re-explore the topic of anonymity and player behavior. Some of our fundamental understanding for how anonymization influences social behavior stems from research conducted in Seattle during the 70s. On Halloween, nearly 1,400 trick-or-treaters unknowingly became subjects in an experiment in which bowls of candy sat on one side of a researcher's porch, while a bowl of coins sat on the other side. The owner of the house greeted the kids and instructed them to take only one piece of candy from the bowl. They would then tell the kids that they had to go do something real quick, which gave them an excuse to leave the kids unattended with bowls of candy and money. Instead, they were actually stepping behind a viewing wall to observe the actions of the kids. Some of these kids were asked to give their names, some were not. In some cases, one child would be singled out and made responsible for the group, so that if all of the kids in his or her group broke the one piece of candy rule, that one kid would be held responsible. Only 7.5% of kids who trick-or-treated alone and had to divulge their names took extra candy or took from the bowl of money. That rate shot up to 20% for kids who arrived at the house in groups, even in groups full of kids who gave their names. Non-anonymous groups of kids and anonymous lone trick-or-treaters were slightly more likely to engage in this rule-breaking behavior. Next was the experimental group full of anonymous kids who had no one to keep them accountable. 57.7% of that experimental group engaged in transgressive behavior. But by far, the most transgressive experimental group were the kids who were anonymous, but who had had a single child designated to keep the rest of the group accountable. This actually backfired spectacularly. Over 80% of the kids in that group took extra candy or money. And that seems really counterintuitive, but the result is attributed to an effect called de-individuation. It's a group phenomenon in which self-awareness ebbs away. Functioning as an anonymous group who could pin the blame on one single person, they acted together to steal extra candy and money. They had a scapegoat and the value of anonymity. But according to the social identity model of de-individuation effects, SIDE, simply being de-individuated isn't a cause in and of itself for bad behavior. Instead, it makes you more sensitive to group cues and allows you to sublimate into a group and conform to that group's actions. To take an example from the UCF Retro Lab, being de-individuated doesn't predispose someone to wanting to riot, for instance, but a de-individuated person in a crowd is more likely to riot if they think everyone else is rioting around them. The identity of the group and being a functioning part of that group and being accepted by it, no matter how toxic that group's behavior, leads to conformity with the norms and standards of said group. Or so the argument goes for proponents of side theory. So that makes it sound like the obvious solution is to pull back the veil of anonymity to curb de-individuation and to expose the trolls, the griefers, the ragers in games to the light of day. but that's a really drastic option that comes with some drawbacks. While that would filter out some of the trolls who are simply engaging in toxic behavior for kicks, that doesn't address people who demonstrate a pattern of heinous behavior even when the entire world is watching, of which there are a depressing number of examples. If your in-group, the social structure to which you identify with, deems that kind of behavior acceptable, you are less likely to be discouraged from engaging in that behavior even when your real name is out there for the world to see. And right now, it might sound like I'm speaking broadly about a greater social context, and Facebook comments, and news article comments, and punditry, and not about specifically online gaming and gaming forums. But let's recontextualize this. Let's say I make a habit out of lashing out at players in Overwatch who are either new to the game, or don't play well, or don't follow the strategy I've laid out, because of course, I obviously have a very high opinion of my ability to command my team to victory. In my mind, by making the experience as unpleasant as possible for these people, I'm doing the entire Overwatch population a favor by driving out low-quality players. Or at the very least, I'm taking everybody down with me. I can easily delude myself into believing my toxic behavior is not only not transgressive, but morally righteous. I'm doing the community a favor. That doesn't change if my real name is out there or not. It only changes if I'm forced to be held accountable for my pattern of bad behavior, and if I'm given feedback from the community, the social group with which I identify, saying that this is unacceptable. Now, if the veil of anonymity is lifted, maybe that leads to somebody finding my Facebook account and tracking down my employer and getting me terminated from my job, and maybe that teaches me a lesson. Maybe that modifies my behavior, maybe that forces me to dig in my heels and entrench myself in my position. But let's just say that that is the accountability that comes from removing anonymity from online games. The owners of the game, Blizzard in this case, can also just hold me accountable by gathering data from my chat logs and user reports made against me, and they can do all of that while still keeping everyone else anonymous. They can take all of that into account and take action against me. So yes, taking anonymity away is an option, but it isn't the only option available to modify player behavior, or at least to remove toxic elements from the community. Another problem with stripping anonymity away is that it also opens up already vulnerable groups to more targeted harassment campaigns by leaving them exposed. People might be more afraid that an abuser will find them if they post, or if they type in chat and thus expose their names and identities. It can have a double-sided effect. Riot, the owners and developers of League of Legends, found this out with their own research. Quote, only about 1% of players were consistently toxic, but it turned out that these trolls produced only about 5% of the toxicity in League of Legends. The vast majority was from the average person just having a bad day. They behaved well for the most part, but lashed out on rare occasions. Which brings us back to alternate methods of modifying group behavior. One experiment that Riot tried was giving out in-game tips before matches, priming their players ahead of time. Some of these messages said things like, quote, players perform better if you give them constructive feedback after a mistake, or teammates perform worse if you harass them after a mistake. These tips were displayed in various colors, and a control group in which no tips were given was tested against. Because of League of Legends' enormous player base, Riot was able to collect vast quantities of experimental data very quickly. And they found that, quote, the warning about harassment leading to poor performance reduced negative attitudes by 8.3%, verbal abuse by 6.2%, and offensive language by 11%, compared with controls. But the tip had a strong influence only when presented in red, a color commonly associated with error avoidance in Western cultures. In 2011, they instituted the Tribunal, a community review board which doled out punishments to players frequently reported for engaging in bad behavior. In this first run of the Tribunal, feedback for bans dished out to toxic players was slow to show up, so they just went back to their terrible ways once the bans expired. But after tweaking the system and automating the generation of a behavioral report card, which gave players feedback on why they were being reported so often and why they were being banned, this caused a massive spike in players reforming their behavior due to community feedback and accountability. They went further still and tried to incentivize sportsmanlike conduct by giving out players who behaved themselves in-game rewards, a form of positive reinforcement. and this became the basis for the honor system, commendations you can give out to other players for being nice or helpful. After accruing enough honor, you would get a ribbon you could flaunt in your profile to show everyone that you are a force for net good in the community. And again, positive player behavior on the whole increased and negative player behavior decreased, according to internal metrics in the form of behavior reports. League of Legends games are still by many accounts not the most hospitable of environments, but means of group behavior modification are still developing, and Riot has shown some impressive improvements so far. Improvements which other gaming communities can and should learn from to make wider gaming culture a less toxic place. And again, none of this is to say that this is a simple problem to solve, even when you confine it to just online games in the respective forums. And yes, taking away the security of anonymity might be an option, but it's an option that might also do more harm than good. But we can't know for sure until someone tries it, and that represents a really drastic measure. But before we go to that nuclear option, we should look at some of the other success stories out there and consider other ways of rooting out bad behavior, like developers holding players accountable, providing feedback to people so they know explicitly what behavior is unacceptable, priming players to behave better, and overall attempting to gradually shift what constitutes acceptable online conduct in a variety of ways. So that's going to be it for this season of Tiny Voices. Next week, we're going to be doing a post-mortem for Season 3. If you guys like this series, please help me spread the word about it, tell others about the show, and please remember to hit the like button, leave a comment, and if you like my content, you can subscribe for more of it on a daily basis. Next season is hopefully going to start up sometime in either February or March, and if things go well, I'm planning on doing 2 seasons next year. And again, thank you all for staying with me. This continues to be a really fulfilling project. So thank you all for watching. Take it easy. Have a good one, everyone.